Hi, I'm Shae Helterbran, and I did this project along with Jill Madsen. We are junior nursing students at Carroll, and we decided to do our SURF project on the effects of firearm regulation on suicide rates. We chose to research this because suicide by firearm continues to threaten the lives of American citizens. As a result, there is a need for a national discussion on firearm legislation for increased safety. As a result, our PICO question is, in the United States, do increased firearm regulations compared to minimal firearm regulations affect suicide completion rates? Prior to discussing the results of our research, we felt it was important to define what suicide is, what state and gun regulations are, and what the prevalence of suicide is. Suicide is defined as death caused by injuring oneself with the intent to die. Suicide is not influenced by one individual factor. It includes a combination of psychosocial, biological, interpersonal, environmental, and societal influences. Some suicide warning signs include feeling like a burden, feeling isolated, increased anxiety, looking for access to lethal means, increased anger or rage, sleeping too much or too little, and talking about plans for death. Risk factors for suicide include living in an isolated area, lack of availability to mental and behavioral health services, socioeconomic factors, and sociocultural factors. A few risk factors for increased risk of suicide are multi-level. These levels include individual, relationship, community, and societal factors. State and gun regulations that have been implemented throughout the years include firearm regulations in the United States that began in 1791 by the ratification of the Second Amendment of the Constitution. Yet, this right is not without limitations. The United States Supreme Court has implemented several regulations since. National regulations include the National Firearms Act of 1934, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, the Brady-Hand Gun Violence Act of 1993, the Violent Control and the Law Enforcement Act of 1994. In 2016, President Barack Obama attempted to further restrict firearms to decrease gun violence with no success. As a result, there are currently no federal laws banning semi-automatic assault weapons, military-style caliber rifles, handguns, or large-capacity magazines. States do have individual rights and can further implement regulations on an individual basis. These regulations include mandatory waiting periods, universal background checks, gun lock requirements, and limitations on open carry. It's important to note that the United States is composed of less than 5% of the world's population, yet it has access to 46% of the world's civilian-owned guns. Moreover, it ranks number 1 in firearms per capita. Finally, what is the prevalence of suicide in America and suicide completion with firearm? Suicide rates have increased 28% from 2000 to 2015. According to the CDC, in 2015, suicide was responsible for 44,193 deaths in the United States, which is approximately one suicide every 12 minutes. In 2017, the CDC reported that suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Suicide by firearm accounted for half of all suicide completions. Overall, the purpose of our SURF project was to analyze evidence and research that shows the effects of firearm regulation in reducing suicide completion by firearm in Americans. Suicide rates are rapidly increasing, and the aim of the study is to explore regulations that may decrease suicide rates, specifically by firearm. To begin our research, we examined 4 articles. Our first article was titled Associations Between Gun Laws and Suicides, which was done in 2019. It was a Level 3 retrospective comparative study. In this study, they gathered data about all deaths, specifically firearm-related deaths, between the years 2005 and 2015. States with either a provision of present strengthening firearm regulations or a provision absent of weakening gun regulations were given a 1, whereas states with a provision absent of strong firearm regulations were given a 0. The researchers then linked each death to an index of state-level gun control. Results were found using a difference in difference model to calculate the impact of state-level gun control on firearm-related deaths. Overall, there was an association between stricter gun laws with lower rates of firearm suicides in the overall population. Our second article was handgun legislation and changes in the statewide overall suicide rates in 2017. This was also a Level 3 retrospective comparative study. Data was gathered between the years 2013 and 2014 from the CDC, while the status of state laws data was gathered from the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. State laws were coded as either present or absent for each state. Laws included were universal background checks, mandatory waiting periods, open carry restrictions, and gun lock restrictions. Overall, the results were that only certain laws are useful in decreasing overall suicide rates. The third article was weaker gun state law. Laws are associated with higher rates of suicide secondary to firearms, which was done in 2017 and was a Level 3 retrospective comparative study. Methods and data for this article were that data was gathered by the Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project of the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality from the years 1998 through 2013. The sample was done by 20% random sample of all non-federal inpatient hospital admissions. To categorize the role of gun laws and the risk of firearm-related suicide, each hospital was put into one of 5 groups. A being the most having strict violations and B lacking regulations. Overall, the results were that between the years 1998 and 2011, firearm suicide attempts continued to be lower in states graded A or B, in contrast with states graded E or F. Yet, based on the study design, it does not prove that there is a direct association between the incidence and mortality. Our fourth article was the association between state laws regulating handgun ownership and statewide suicide rates, which was done in 2015 and was a Level 3 retrospective cross-sectional analysis. Data was gathered from the year 2010. Statewide suicide data was gathered from the CDC, and the status of laws data was from the National Rifle Association Institute for Legislative Action. Laws included were permit to purchase a handgun, registration of handguns, and license to own a handgun. The results were found by the analysis of covariances being run. Overall, the results were that all 3 laws are useful in decreasing the overall suicide rate. Overall, we concluded that there is some evidence showing that stricter gun law regulations decrease suicide rates. However, each study had several limitations that could have influenced suicide rates. Again, certain factors that influenced results included laws enforced, such as universal background checks, mandatory waiting periods, individual factors, and data collection. Based on the analysis of the available research, the PICO question cannot be answered indefinitely, as a result proving the need for further research. After concluding our research, we discussed how we could take this information and use it to reflect change in our own practice. Some ways we decided would be beneficial applications of this research included advocating for stricter firearm regulations by getting involved with issues at the legislative level, becoming educated on current laws and issues, offering education about firearm safety at routine checkups and appointments, partnering with a community resource in order to organize educational classes to increase gun safety for both adults and children, providing mental health resources such as the Suicide Prevention Hotline number, which is 1-800-273-8355, fostering a non-judgmental environment to talk about different things like suicide, guns, and legislation, performing routine screens for gun usage and accessibility, and having safety devices such as gun locks readily available to provide to patients. Overall, we hope this research helped emphasize how many factors affect mental health and how important it is to fight for ways to keep communities safe. Change has to begin with education, and that is what we hope we have provided you with today. Hopefully you leave this presentation knowing how important it is to aim for increased gun safety and decreased risk and rate of suicide completions in the United States. Please remember that if this presentation was in any way triggering to you, the suicide prevention hotline number is located on the bottom of our poster. Thanks for listening.